and welcome to Virtually Connecting. Today we're connecting to Toowoomba in Australia for the Ascolite Conference 2017. My name's Wendy Tallio and I'm your host for Virtually Connecting today. And so I'm going to throw it over to the on-site people for their introductions.
Hi, my name's Sue. I'm a developer at Charles Darwin University based in Alice Springs.
Hi, I'm James Arvanitakis. I'm the Dean of the Graduate Research School at Western Sydney University.
Hi, I'm Barney Dalgarno. I'm Director of Learning Online at Charles Sturt University on the Wagga campus.
I'm Senior Educational Designer at La Trobe University.
Hi, I'm Hank Hauser. I'm Curriculum Designer at the moment at QUT.
Hello, I'm Colin Simpson. I'm an Education Designer at ANU and one of the co-conveners of the Tele-Advisors group with Kate.
Great, thank you. So we'll do introductions, Tim, and then Lynn, and then Kahiwa. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Tim Klepto. I'm the Online Learning Technology Leader at Charles Sturt University.
Hi, I'm Lynn Hay. I'm the Online Learning Innovation Leader at Charles Sturt University.
Hi everyone, my name is Kahiwa Sabaya. I'm a Senior Instructional Designer with Flinders University's New Venture Institute.
Thanks everyone. So back to you guys on site. I know the conference has just started today, but there must be some highlights already, obviously, with the opening keynote.
Undoubtedly so, I'd say.
Not that you're biased or anything.
Saying that our highlight is definitely.
Yeah, it was a rock star performance.
As always, I've seen James. Thought that he might be a one-trick pony, but he's definitely at least a two-trick pony.
Yeah, you're missing out. It started really well just with a welcome to country, and then James enlightened us with his early career moments with bins, which was particularly engaging and entertaining. So it's a shame you couldn't be here.
Yes, I'll add to that. It was very entertaining. It was also nice and interactive. Thanks, James. The key message was pedagogy first, which I think is a really strong and important one.
Everything's been said.
Can I just say a couple of other things? I think the pedagogy first thing obviously is, a message a lot of people have said in different ways. I think you said it in a way that will stick for a while. I think the notion of understanding that learners behave differently and the importance of finding out about students' learning behaviours. I mean, we've got going at Charles at the moment focused on our on-campus teaching, and I think a lot of people's intuitive beliefs about what's going to improve an on-campus experience relate to their own experience as a student, back in the 1980s. And it's when I've got kids at uni, and you kind of start to realise that they study very differently now to the way that we did back then. And so that message about learner choice and understanding learner behaviour, I think, was a really strong one, and particularly important online as well as on campus, I reckon. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, look, I suppose one of the ways I try and talk about this is to think about the way that we consume all sorts of media, like television and so on. When I was growing up, my favourite show, and this will show how old I am, was this thing called The $6 Million Man. It was on as old as me to recognise it, but it was on Sunday nights at 7:30, and we'd all get home and watch it, and it was horrible if you missed an episode, but it was gone forever. You think about the way that we consume a TV series now. People, record or download multiple episodes or binge watch, and in a way, people have different, I suppose, preferences, and I suppose learning in many ways is like that. We have this kind of different approach, and I think that leads to a really important a message, or for me, a really important way of consuming that education is consumed. And I mean, consume in the most possible way, not like a, not like a Coke, but, enjoy it and journey with. Is like old television series. It was about each individual episode, right? And so in a way, the way that most of us are learn to teach is about each individual lecture. Like as a sociologist, I give a lecture on, on class, one on race, one on gender, one on globalization, one and so on, right? But if you think about really the best series that we watch today, to sort of continue that analogy, it's not only about the individual episodes, but it's about the broader story arc that lasts over a season or 2 seasons or 5 seasons. In a way, as educators, we need to think about how the individual bits that we teach fit into that broader learning journey. And I think that's part of the learning, understanding the behavioural way that people learn, to think about, well, how do we continue to make sure that there is an arc that students need to make sense of. And I think part of that is the structural changes that we see in the economy, where we see, accountants used to be employed as accountants, but now the various choices. Students are kind of trying to I suppose, to piece together the puzzle of their upcoming careers. And I think we need to be better at sort of talking about that and showing how those story arcs all fit together.
Just a question about that, James, because when you talk about student choice, I just went to which is about feedback and immediacy of feedback, which kind of relates to the way students consume learning, if you want to call it consuming. But it's quite, you run into an issue of equity at some stage, I think, if you, in terms of what kind of learning you provide, if people are in different locations. So how do you see equity in relation to learner? I guess is the question. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the challenge for us is to do this. I suppose that the challenge is to think about the way that we engage people online as much as what we do when we engage face to face. And I think, there are very specific, and this is what I think in the keynote I sort of said, the learning processes is more than just throwing a bunch of things online, like it's about actually thinking of that delivery and how we do engage people online. What is it that, there are very specific strategies, and most of you, online and watching me face to face probably know these, better, if not better than me, but yeah, so we need to think about it in that way. And I think this is where I think educators really do need your support, because I think most educators, they see it as the same thing, but it's not the same thing. It's not. It's definitely something different. And thinking, well, I'll just do this in class, so I can do this online, or I just do this in my tutorial, I can do this online. They're very, very different strategies. They have to be. It's a very different pedagogy, and I think we need. That's how we need to. That's how I think we confront the equity. And I think, look, there's other things. I mean, it's not just the different campuses. It's some of our students, it's mobile and others, or with Western Sydney University, and I'm sure that other folk listening here, your students, we have a lot of women re-entering the workforce, after they've been carers for a number of years and they're trying to re-enter the workforce, but still they have a number of obligations. So coming into coming into campus becomes hard. So I think those equity issues are really important. But again, I think it's, I think most academics, and I suppose, I've been guilty of this, where you think, oh, well, it's just the same thing, right? Whatever I do face to face, I can do online. But it is very, very different. It does require very, very different engagement strategies.
Just a couple of things that have been said. I bring to mind a couple of the other sessions that I've been to today, and I mean, I think the thing with equity is that because of the fact that students have different life constraints and different needs or wants, everyone takes up different experiences differently. So you can never get the same experience. I mean, equity of opportunity is all you can really aim for. But it just with the choice thing, it really struck me. I went to 2 sessions in a row that were looking at different ways of understanding student behaviour. One was Kelly Trezise from University of Melbourne looking at student self-regulation in essay writing, and they were using this tool where students do all their writing into an online tool, and they encourage them in particular ways to get them to do that. And then they're tracking when students are writing text, when they're editing, when they're pasting from other sources and so on. And it was really interesting that, as we all know, or we suspect, there were some students who left everything to the last minute, but still did really well, and other students that spent days and days and days on it and didn't achieve a lot better than the others. So in terms of what support do those 2 different students need, or what kind of teaching do they need, probably very different teaching. There's no point providing a huge amount of support building up if a student's preference is to just do it at the last minute. And then the second one I was going to say is Danny Lou was talking the student relationship engagement, big growing kind of embryonic analytic system that's used at 5 different unis now for allowing academics to understand students' online behaviour and provide proactive feedback and support to them. And so just I guess it's just kind of I wanted to say that that notion of understanding student behaviour and being responsive to it, well, there's a lot of really cool stuff going on that will help us to be able to do that, I guess.
Yeah, I just had a comment there. One thing is that I'd like to make a shout out to Yoko Mori, who's probably watching this session in Japan. So that's through your recent visit, James, and unfortunately they're unable to join the conversation, but they will be watching. So we've had quite a good exchange over email. And the second comment that I had talking about, different spaces and different ways of doing things was, I noticed, Barney, that your session is one of the only live stream sessions in Ascolite, and I just wondered how that came about.
Well, I think it was Helen Partridge has been the initiator of having that panel session on learning analytics being live streamed. I don't think it's been done before at an Ascolite, and I guess it's probably just the case that we're getting to the point where the streaming and video conferencing technologies are becoming stable enough that you can take a risk and do it. I've been co-opted to be the chair of that session. I'm quite nervous about it. I mean, you guys are quite experienced in the sort of blended synchronous facilitation. I've done a bit of it, but to do it at a big event like Ascolite, where we've got to basically create a nice panel engagement with an audience live as well as a remote audience, just in terms of making that seamless, it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
I think it's always scary. I don't know if anybody else on this call's had experience, but it's always tricky. I don't think you can make it seamless because you've only got one set of eyes.
One of the things I was interested in James's bio, for those that were able to read it, talked about some comparisons between Australia and India. And none of that came out in your session this morning. I'm sure there's a whole other session you could give. In a nutshell, with some of the equity issues that we've been talking about, how does that compare?
Well, a great question. What the best way to put this in one way is to imagine that in a lot of the Indian universities I've worked at, they still get their exam results pasted up on the wall with their student numbers, and so all the students have to fight around the, have to stand around and try and fight. Yeah, I know.
So exciting.
Yeah, they were exciting. Yeah, it was like, I can see a couple of people who are younger than me going, "Oh my God, did that actually happen in real life?" Yeah, it happened. It's not just bad. US, Hollywood movies. I suppose that the thing about India that is really interesting is the high tech universities. The technology is so amazing, but it's such a small percentage of those universities. That's the first thing. The second thing is the scale. You know, we're talking about, you know, 15,000, I think, you know, higher ed institutions compared to like 39, you know. So it's a scale, and we're talking about the employment scale of, you know, 1 million or 2 million students, you know, going through a process. I do this exercise where and again, this is like technology and pedagogy, right? On the face is, I do this exercise when I'm online with my students in Australia, where they can choose their own adventure. So depending on how confident they are, they can pick. You know, either they do something on their own, they can work in groups, or they can come and work with one of the tutors or with me on it. And so it allows them to kind of work through those different strategies. Now, in India, I employed the same thing, but with bits of coloured paper, right? So in the class, the students had to come down and pick either the green, the blue, or the red paper, depending on how confident they were with concepts. So it's just about, you know, again, realise that on an equity way, you are dealing with a very very different cohort. You know, in some ways really, really savvy, but in other ways really limited to the access that they have. And definitely, I mean, you know, in Australia, I can probably go to any university and I can walk in with a certain number of assumptions regarding the technology, the knowledge systems and everything like that we're dealing with. In India, you just can't do that. You know, that everything is so radically, you know, different depending on where you go to. I mean, the other area I've done a lot of work is in South Africa, which is a fascinating place to work, and it's you know, and it just shows you know, in a way how privileged we are in Australia. You know, I think something like, I heard the Vice Chancellor from Witwatersrand University, based in Johannesburg, and he said something like, you know, this year 1 million students will start school by year 6, half of them will drop out. Only half of those will make it into a higher ed college. Half of those will drop out by the end of first year. You know, another half will drop out by then in second year, and only half will graduate. And from 1 million, they'll get 10th in university. And the loss of you know, the productivity, the economic, the cultural, the social, the human cost of those dropouts, you know, is enormous. And so one of the things I, you know, would like to sort of challenge us all on is to see how we can use our amazing networks in Australia to connect with international institutions and see how we can use our to do those partnerships with these really high-profile universities around the world. But there's also room for us to connect with other universities and work and assist with those.
So one of the things, the things that has come up in the discussion about e-learning in India and South Africa and other places is the promise of mobile devices. So would you say most people have access to a mobile device, and is M-learning seen as a viable option for getting around the equity kind of digital divide stuff?
Yeah, I mean, mobile devices are everywhere. I think it's the cultural change to access them as learning tools that really are difficult. Yeah, that's where the challenge is, because they're not seen in that same way. So I think there's a real challenge for actually to bring the educators there along for the ride. You know, it's not so much the students that you probably convince them quite easily, but you know, there are certain traditional patterns that are followed. And I think what we need to do is think about, well, how do we disrupt, or how can we work with academics in those in certain areas to help disrupt those patterns and actually take advantage of technologies. And you're right, I mean, mobile devices, and they appear everywhere, and in many ways, especially in India, people are so much more connected than what we are, as in like the available to internet, and the cost is incredibly cheap as well. So but that again, there's huge potential there. I think there's the cultural shift that has to happen, that we need with educators there to understand how we can make that happen.
Yeah, but the other related challenge to that, I think, is the technology itself as well, because there's there's loads of mobile devices out there, But there's a very wide range of the quality of those devices and what you can potentially do with them. There's also the cultural element happens. I worked for a while in the Northern Territory, and in communities, mobile devices are really, really useful because, as communication devices, but not necessarily always as learning devices. And all sorts of challenges and issues with that. No.
I was going to ask if there's questions from some of the virtual participants, and then I guess after that, I'd be keen to note what people's key takeaways are so far at the conference.
Wendy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just waiting to see if Tim, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I was curious about the concepts of learner preferences and learner choice in this area, and I guess the idea of what a designed experience is about in those kinds of spaces. Is this about providing a kind of free-for-all, or should there be more structure around a learning experience so that we're kind of designing with very specific intents rather than just a kind of, here's a wall of toothpaste, you can choose from any different kind of size, tube, color, all that kind of stuff. That's really just a confusing kind of experience. Whereas, should there be more design and kind of consideration about what we're doing rather than just a kind of free-for-all around our learning and education?
Yeah, look, I remember probably, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, someone to me that the road is paved with 1,000 failures, right? And so let's just all play around with our devices and fail. But I think we've come a long way since then. I think we do have a lot of insights about setting up frameworks for what in delivering. So yeah, I don't think it's a free for all. I think there are frameworks that we can employ, and I think there are we can learn from the same, but we should never give up on experimenting either and trying something new. And the way I always think about it is if you have really strong foundations in the way that you deliver your learning, then you can afford to be experimental, in other spaces. So you can afford to take risks as long as your core foundations are really strong. And so, I mean, the way I think about it is if you've got a really strong, I mean, even if you, let's think about it in the curriculum way. I always think if we got really, really strong curriculum, say delivering say more subjects to a really strong law curriculum, then there's always going to be room for 1 or 2 or 3 or partial percentage for us to really challenge those structures and see if there's something we can learn by challenging those established structures. And I think the same thing can be applied in a way for this environment.
I mean, I thought Tim's question was really apt because he almost could have been at your presentation in asking that question, because one of the things James mentioned was announceables, and I kind of found, on the one hand, you were saying, use timely case studies, use a newspaper article from yesterday to kind of make something seem much more relevant to students, but at the same time, design. And I mean, say in an online context, we're grappling at CSU with the question of, do we want to try and improve the production values of our online subject content by having a professional production team involved, still the act in the development, but have it really strongly developed in advance? Then if you do that, you get that strong design, but then the challenge is having that sort of timely yesterday's newspaper article coming in. And I guess what you just said in response to Tim's question kind of answers that, saying the core foundations online might be really well designed online materials, but for timely, responsive teaching. So yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, thank you. They're much more articulate than I put them, than the words that I had in my mouth. Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, I think you put it perfectly, Barney. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, but I think, we do need to, I think, there is something that to put a bit of effort into production values, but that shouldn't stifle the creativity or the, about, that shouldn't also, stop us from sort of encouraging sometimes, again, one of my colleague in Western Sydney, he does these, he's pretty hopeless at it, I will say. I won't mention his name, but he just sits there and he talks into a camera for like a minute or two, just preparing students for the lectures. It's actually really endearing, and it's just but he does all this other stuff that's really high production values, works with the blended online learning teams. But those bits that he does like on a weekly basis with his iPhone is actually kind of makes you feel that, yeah, it is kind of really live and it's happening. And he does stuff around war and conflict, and he talks about, recently he was doing stuff on North Korea, and if he'd done, there's no way he could have, him talking to it on an instant basis was fantastic. Yeah,
I think it's kind of interesting about the production values, because it has kind of become a lot more like learners are a lot more used to bad production values, or immediacy, which actually works in our favor.
Yeah, I think I mean, part of that to me comes down to some of the things that you've talked about, and I've heard in other sessions today about building teacher presence and building some authenticity, and sometimes that's maybe a little bit rough and ready can add to that. Sometimes you lose some of that kind of authenticity when it's highly polished, in that people kind of are conscious of what they're saying and maybe overthinking things rather than maybe being as authentic as they could. And so sometimes you can lose that teacher presence. But I guess one of the other talks point with, I guess, do we, having highly structured environments versus more kind of flexible, free-for-all environments. There's been some really interesting things coming out around, like Meg Colasante's talk today was kind of talking about the disruptions and contradictions, in that students want flexibility and they want to kind of, there's some students who want that autonomy in their learning, but at the same time they also want this kind of weird contradiction there, and it's about, I guess, trying to find a good balance there. And some of the other kind of key takeaways I've found today have just been around asking the students what they want. And I guess it's kind of hard, because if you ask the students and you get these different responses, then you have to then filter that and figure out what do they mean by that. But at the same time, it seems like that's something that we often forget to do or don't do enough, is asking students what they want and then trying to feed that back into the process.
But I think there's a lot of diversity in that, though. Like, so you have to, when you do, for example, if you're designing an online learning environment and you think about synchronous versus asynchronous, if you ask the students, like, you'll get very different responses, because for some students it's the asynchronous thing is a lot better, because and others want a learning community where they can constantly communicate with people in a sort of immediacy, and it's very difficult to find a kind of balance in that sometimes.
I always say you need engagement, but with flexibility in how that engagement occurs, and that might be 3 or 4 redundant choices for students, because you've got a number of different subgroups who have different needs.
I'm just noticing Kahiwa's comment in the chat saying that, now it's just moved. Oh, no, there it is. There to be a shift in focus for support people, tele-advisors, whatever, to be considered more as learning experience designers, which I think sums a lot of this up quite well, because it's about the whole package. Yeah.
Just a couple of points. Just going back to that authenticity. One of my first keynotes, someone came up to me. This is going back just after, it's probably going back like 5 years now. Someone came up to me and said to me, you're this is a colleague, that it was, I can't remember which keynote it was or which conference it was, but it was another academic, come up to me and said to me, look, this is probably not going to sound like a compliment, but it's meant to be a compliment. It's always great when someone begins a sentence like that. But he said, really the best thing about your keynote, polished. And he said, and then I realized, and then he said, I watched you present and I thought to myself, I can do that. And there was something about, I think that's been a really nice takeaway message for me. Like, no matter how much, what I've done along the way is I've always tried to present in a way that allows people to go, oh yeah, that doesn't look, you know what I mean? If you had $1 million, you go off for a year, you come back with something incredibly polished, but everyone will say that's fantastic, but it won't be applicable. And I think there's something in that about trying to make it applicable. The second thing to say is a lot of my research is around young people and political engagement. And one of the things that often happens with engagement, political engagement, is people tend to follow one or two strategies when talking to young people. They either go, tell us what you want, and you offer someone a blank piece of paper, right? And you know, and if someone asks me what I want, I'll spaceship, but I'm not going to get that, right? You can't offer someone a blank piece of paper, or tell us what you think, which is after you've done something, you go to the end product and you say, you know, what do you think of this? Something in between that. I think you touched on it. You know, it's like this is the type of thing that we can do. This is the type of delivery, or this is the type of approach that I've been doing. What's your feedback? What can we do? How can we build? How can I get you? What's restricting your access? So it's not just about sort of saying, I think that type of engagement and getting students involved is about being really clear about where your boundaries are. You know, some of the, you know, especially around, you know, when we're talking about law or engineering, where really most of the content is provided by an external body, you know, or most of the structures are provided by an external body. So it's not often, there's not a huge amount of always a huge amount of level. Sort of saying, well, what is the best way for us to work together around some of these issues? I think is the way to think about it. And so when we you know, we've been designing some stuff and we get students in, we say, well, these are the boundaries, the limitations, the budgets that we have. This is the even by saying things like, you know, this will be delivered in spring semester, so that means that, you know, it can only be done like, you know, these are the hard lines that we're working with. So what can we do within that to shape something that's a bit more, you know, that works with you a bit better. So yeah, it doesn't have to be going back to your point, Tim, it doesn't have to be a free for all. It can be something that is that's structured, but the shape of it can still be quite. There's quite a lot of room to reshape it.
If I could just make a comment in there, I think that there's been really interesting conversations for probably the last year or two about how we hear what students say that they want or what they value. And what I think I'm really interested in seeing where the thinking goes is how we can balance what students say that they want or what they think or experience out of something they've tried, and what we know as educators or, you know, education designers that they actually need for an optimal experience, and where our responsibility is to pick or what we think we know is correct, and that combination in there is where I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts on.
Yeah, and I mean, we're sort of trying to really up the ante on flexibility on the programs, so that's creating a lot of discussion around the university around exactly that point. So people thinking that they know what their students need better than the students do. The reality is, if you're a 35-year-old working professional doing a postgraduate degree, you kind of have to be given the credit for knowing how you personally need to study to achieve the outcomes. As long as the assessment measures the outcome, there really shouldn't be any compulsion for you to participate in learning activities that have been designed for you to achieve those outcomes if you reckon you can achieve them some other way. So I kind of go with the student choice a little bit more. It might be different for a first out of school undergraduate who, you know, much choice, they'll end up at the bar and they'll plan to complete their assignments on that very last day before they're due, but something else will come up. But for working adults, I think, you know, you've got to kind of not be too much, you know, better than they learn.
It's sometimes a very difficult balance. I've worked a couple of years in China where in an institution where most students there were school leavers. And so pretty much when you ask them what they want you to just give them very clear guidelines that lead to very good exam results. That's and what we're trying to do is kind of the opposite. Like we're trying to challenge them at the same time, you know. So there's this, to find the balance is difficult sometimes.
That's to do with, I guess, cultural backgrounds and what they're used to culturally, and versus what you're trying to push as far as moving them towards other educational goals and building their autonomy or critical thinking skills. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that point, you know, with different students from different cultural backgrounds is really interesting. One of the things, as a grad student now, we do these for our PhD students. And, you know, when I first took on that role, you know, I went to the orientation, and the orientation was, you know, you need to fill in this form, you need to do this, and you need to register here and register here. And this is what happens if, you know, if you don't get along with your supervisor. This is what happens if you get busted for plagiarism. You know, and it's like, and like, there's like 100 forms for 100 different scenarios, and you can just see everyone glazing over. But I think specifically for international students, the biggest challenge is to get them to join the research culture of the university. So what we do at orientation now is we just get our students to write. Right? We literally get them to talk about their research to each other. So they sit down, they make a friend. We try and pair international students. They make a friend research. They talk to each other about what they want to research, and they start writing this down. And the idea being is that one of the things that we say to them is, you need to, you know, culturally in Australia, you're expected to lead your research, right? You're not going to get your supervisor telling you to do every day. So, so again, when we're dealing with our students, I think, you know, one of the things that I think we really need to do is when we do need to find that balance between structure and flexibility, and it's never easy, right? It's a shifting balance, and that's the ultimate goal. And is if you can answer the why, like why you're doing this, why are we doing this, why are we encouraging our students to go down this path, then that, I think that's part of that kind of building that narrative about getting students to buy in. And yeah, you know, and I think about this. One of my this is classic listening to the students and getting it wrong was the one year when I had an exam, when I was in one of those big first year subjects. A group of students came to me and said to me, you know, it's really hard, as you know, we have all this care and response, it's really hard to turn up to an exam, right? And so can you shift the exam process? You know, can you shift how you do the exam process? And I was like, okay. So then I thought about it. I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll do a take-home exam, right? So I came up with this idea of a take-home exam. And so the following year, I came up with a take-home exam, and all these students came to me and were like, why a take-home exam? We've got all these care responsibilities, and we take the home exam at home, and all our students, all our, you know, our kids are driving us crazy because no one believes that you do take-home exams, right? So it's like, oh, okay, that was wrong. You know, you shouldn't. But then in the end, I ended up with 2 exam options. I gave the students 2 exam options. They could do take-home exam, or they could do in class. So then I was, okay, well, why make it either or? Why not the best way? So yeah, there's always a risk when we listen to students that you can oversteer the ship. You know what I mean? You can overcompensate, and I think that's a bit hard. And I know I've done it a number of times where I've gone, oh, you know, why did I over listen in a way?
I set a take-home exam once. My past life, I used to teach IT, and I set what I thought was a 3-hour exam. And I asked one of the questions, how many hours did you spend on this? They had 24 hours to do it. The most anyone spent was 22 hours. The average was about 12 hours, and it was right at the beginning of the exam period. So I probably killed those students' preparation for all their other subjects. Basically, they spent as long as they had. Again, it just wasn't fair to do that to them. Same again. I just thought, oh, this will be really nice. It'll give them the flexibility. They can do it on the computer rather than handwritten. No. It was a disaster. Yeah.
I was just going to do a time check if you guys are aware that you're in your lunch break. So we're happy to wrap up here if you guys need to scoot. We've got some interesting comments in the group chat.
From the remote people before we go, because we've kind of talked a lot amongst ourselves.
Go, Lynn, if you'd like.
Have we missed anything?
No, she's happy. She's got a lot of magpies in the background where she is.
Sorry, I just had trucks going by. I'm sitting outside a bakery. Yeah, look, that was an interesting discussion, guys. Thanks for that. I really enjoyed it, and I'm now disappointed I'm not at Ascolite this year. But it was a really interesting discussion about the design of learning materials. I actually just included a few points, posted a few points to Twitter about, you know, just being aware of the culture of perfect when it comes to designing online subject material. And I think social media provides a really powerful back channel to keep current up-to-date material in those sorts of subjects. Sorry, another car. But anyway, thanks. It was really interesting, and thanks, Wendy, for hosting this. I've really appreciated it.
Thanks, Lynn. And I'd just like to note that, you know, Henk has been interested in joining this virtually connecting before, but he actually couldn't do that from China. So, you know, Google Hangouts were blocked from there. So, and there's been, you know, in the background, I've been working with people who haven't been able to get into the Hangout today. So there's always going to be issues like, I haven't reset my password. So things like that are still, you might think they're minor, but they're happening. Do you have any last comments, Kahiwa?
I just wanted to say thank you very much to all the group at Toowoomba. Really appreciate you making the time. My FOMO is now at level 11 about having to miss it out, but thank you so much for being part of the chat. And thanks, Wendy.
And Tim?
No, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone as well. So good to see the conversation kicking on. It's good.
All right. Thank you. It's been really good to connect, and thanks very much to everybody who's been willing to connect in this way. And we'll be looking out on Twitter for all the rest of the feed, because we will be in that space, and we'll be signing up for Barney's session if that's applicable as well. So I'm just putting up my hat for more live streaming for future conferences in Australia.
Yes.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Have a great conference.
No worries, Lynn. So we're just we're still live streaming. We're happy to keep chatting, but no, you on site focus, that's fine. Sue, if you want to mute. It's always a bit of a juggle with technology. So if you guys are okay, I will stop the broadcast now and we can continue chatting.